This is the On All Cylinders podcast,
powered by Summit Racing.
Your host for today is Summit Racing's Paul KJ8 EEP with special guest, radio communications expert Dan WB7OXP.
Here we go.
Welcome to another edition of the On All Cylinders podcast. Paul KJ8 EEP in your host chair today. And in case you were wondering what that alphabet soup means at the end of my name, that's my call sign because I am a licensed ham radio operator. And it's relevant today because we're talking all about RF communications. And that's a topic that's near and dear to my heart because as an off-roader, as a licensed ham operator, and a former broadcast industry professional, I love to talk about radio. And radio communications is an important part of a lot of facets of the automotive hobby, be it racing, be it off-roading or overlanding. So to help illuminate this subject, we brought on Dan, WB7OXP, also a licensed ham radio operator and an expert in RF communications and a diehard off-roader too. So he's got a lot to talk about. He is from the Summit Racing sister company, DX Engineering, and those folks know an awful lot about radio. So with that said, Dan, thank you for joining us on the show today.
Morning, Paul. Nice to see you.
Now, Dan, I alluded to your expertise a bit in the introduction, but really spell it out for us. What makes you so uniquely qualified to talk about the topic today?
Okay, so I had the privilege, I guess, of growing up in Silicon Valley as Silicon Valley was getting built. So I was surrounded by electronics and people who knew about electronics. It's kind of ironic. My father was an accountant. And he doesn't believe in electricity. He thought there were magic hamsters in the wall. But all of my family, all the kids ended up electrical engineers. So I've been playing with the ham radio and radio since I was a little kid. When I was in first grade, I was the only person bringing radios that I'd built for show and tell. So that's been a long time. I really have enjoyed radio and remember learning a lot about walkie-talkies and playing with them when I was a kid. And that's really when I started playing with communications. And it just kind of grew from there. On into ham radio, CB radio, and military emergency and other kinds of communications.
But as an added bonus, you are quite qualified to talk about off-roading. Could you explain that a little bit?
So I live at the base of the mountain that all the gold and silver came out of Virginia City, Nevada in. Actually, I live in the dirt. We have Jeeps with great big tall tires just to get home, and even wild horses in our front yard. The road that I live nearest goes to Virginia City. It's the road that the Bonanza people would have ridden to go to lunch if they could ride 100 miles in a few hours. But nonetheless, so every day, hundreds probably of off-road vehicles pass my house, all with lots of radios. And I've raced a lot of the more famous races, Baja, Vegas to Reno, and some of the others. And I've been really an avid off-roader since I was a little kid. Racing motocross and also with off-road trucks and Jeeps.
So yeah, the perfect guy to talk about this sort of thing. With that said, explain to us, why is radio communications so important to like the racing and off-roading communities?
So off-road communications are really important. With Baja, you can imagine people are 500 miles. They're driving incredibly fast. And it's important that not only do they know where each other are, that the track officials know where they are, but in the event of some kind of a mishap, that they can get help. Things have changed a lot, but radio's been a really important part of off-road racing for since the inception. As long as they could figure out a way to do it, they've always had some kind of off-road radio communications in their trucks. In the groups, Jeep, Jamboree, and some of the others are now requiring communications. When you're traveling in groups, it's really important to be able to talk to each other, and leaning out of your truck or Jeep and yelling just doesn't work as well as the radios do.
I think we've all been whacked by the errant tree branch while on a tight trail. So I know exactly what you mean there. But before we go much further, so far we've been using the word radio as kind of a blanket statement to cover all the different classifications of radio frequencies available and the types of radios out there that you can use. And without trying to complicate things too much, there are some significant distinctions. You've got CB radio, you've got GMRS radio, you've got FRS radio, you've got ham radio. And there's a ton of nuance between what frequencies you can use, what power levels you can use. So, Dan, can you kind of start to break those down for us?
Okay. So when I was a kid, most of us were familiar with CB radio, if nothing else from the movie Convoy. Even those people knew they needed to talk to each other. So CB radio was probably the first thing we were seeing in the Jeeps and in the off-road trucks. CB radio had a lot of great things going for it. It would go 15, 20, 30 miles pretty easily, but it had a few problems, and those problems were actually both benefits and negative, and that was called skip. CB radio and the way it acts and the frequencies it's on are often capable of talking around the world. And when you're trying to talk to the guy next to you and you're hearing the guy from a foreign country or a foreign state, it gets hard. And so as a result, some other frequencies became more popular. GMRS is one of them. The purpose of GMRS, similar to CB, was to make a really easy to use, easy to obtain, and I'll say in both cases, unlicensed or lightly licensed. GMRS is licensed these days, CB isn't, but it's a really easy to obtain radio service to provide people a way to communicate actually for all kinds of activities, indoors and outdoors. GMRS is General Mobile Radio Service. CB was Citizens Band. At one point, GMRS was actually part of CB. GMRS lives on some frequencies that don't go very far. They'll go 1 to 2 miles with handhelds and maybe up to 10 or 15 on the flat between vehicles. And then they also have another option called repeaters, which I think we'll talk about later, that lets them go farther.
And there's another classification called FRS, and you might find that if you're shopping for radios at like a box store or something. Can you explain that a bit and perhaps explain why FRS may not be a good choice for your race car or off-roader?
So FRS and GMRS share 22 channels, 16 depending who you ask, but they share some channels. They are somewhat interoperable to various degrees. FRS is family radio service. It replaced CB and the little channel 14 walkie-talkies for the most part. They're very low power radios with very strong rules about what they're allowed to do. FRS at best will go a mile. The other problems with FRS radios is their batteries don't last very long, and most of them are not physically very robust. So they get destroyed pretty quickly. My favorite part of FRS is a lot of those radios are G.I. Joe and Barbie and Tim the Truck and all kinds of other things and wristwatches. So I love FRS radios because they're creative.
But when it comes to racing and off-roading, you would generally steer folks towards a GMRS radio?
I generally play with GMRS if I'm working with people that don't have a lot of radio skills. Although it is fun, in my neighborhood, everybody has GMRS, and the FRS radios can talk to them. So once in a while, Barbie and G.I. Joe will chime in on the same frequencies, and they can talk.
And I'm sure those conversations get pretty interesting. Now, the elephant in the room here is smartphones. If you don't have a whole lot of familiarity with off-roading or radio communications, you might be asking yourself, what's the point of having a fancy, expensive radio in my truck if I have a state-of-the-art communications computer in my pocket, right? So, Dan, can you explain why radio is still a massive component of communications, even in the smartphone era?
The first part of that is to remember why you have a spare tire or more if you're off-roading, and that is because you can't count on any one thing all the time. So it's important not to be a one-trick pony, that's my favorite, and only have one form of communications, and communications is critical. The smartphone is fine for what it's fine for, but you hear so often, especially off-road, and especially in areas like mine that are highly mountainous, of no signal, which is one of the reasons that there's so many problems with search and rescue. When you have no signal, you have no cell phone, so you have no communications. The radios go radio to radio, so you're not looking to anything else but yourself and the equipment in your truck to talk. So it's important to have lots of toys. The Jeeps I build usually have at least 3 radios in them, plus more in other bags and stuff, because I don't count on any one tool ever. There's more than one tool in my toolbox.
Very excellent points. For both practical and technical reasons, carrying a redundant radio makes a lot of sense when you're heading off-road. Now, you've alluded to ham radio and GMRS radio licensing, and that is regulated by the Federal Communications Commission. So shed some light on that topic. What licenses are required for GMRS and ham radio to be able to legally operate on the air?
So GMRS, the purpose of the licensing is mostly so that there's some identification of what transmitters are out there. GMRS license is merely a matter of applying for the license, which can be done online. It costs $35. It's good for 10 years. And unlike other services, GMRS is actually for the whole family. So one GMRS license covers the whole family. And all you have to do is go on the FCC site, create a profile, and then get your license. A ham radio license, and ham is an amateur radio license, requires testing. There used to be more categories, but right now there's only 3 licenses. There's technician, general, and extra. Each one requires a knowledge test, a theory knowledge test, and a law knowledge test, and they get progressively harder. With the ham licenses, as they get harder, you get more and more privileges, and the most privileges you'll ever get will be the extra license. The tests are reasonably hard. They're reasonably comprehensive, but they're certainly doable. I actually even encourage most of the people around me to get ham licenses because it at least forces you to learn that part of physics. So ham licensing is fun. You understand the radios better, and you get lots more privileges as you work your way up the ladder.
So yeah, if you do go the ham radio route, it does require some knowledge of like FCC regulations and RF electronics theory, but it really doesn't start ratcheting up until you start upgrading to like general and extra. To get your base level technician's license, it's not that tough. It really is doable. That said, if you just want to hop in your truck and head off-road, Dan, would you recommend a GMRS setup?
Absolutely. If you don't think you're going to enjoy the radio hobby and you just want to enjoy off-roading, playing in the park, talking between your boats, whatever, hang gliders are real popular behind me, GMRS is a great way to go. The commercial offerings on the GMRS radios are so nice and so varied, from tens of dollars up to hundreds of dollars. You can just get a lot of communications for not a lot of money. GMRS is certainly much easier to use. One of the things I really like about GMRS is that it's channelized, which means if you go to some store and buy a GMRS radio and your friend goes to another store, buys the GMRS radio, your channel 1 and their channel 1 are the same. So there's just very little skill required to operate the radios. You push the mic button and talk. I think mic fright is probably a bigger problem than any other part of using the radios.
Okay, so let's continue down that path. Say we've successfully convinced someone to buy a GMRS radio. They visit summitracing.com, they visit dxengineering.com, they see plenty of options, but it's important to realize that they essentially come in 2 basic flavors. You've got your handheld walkie-talkies or handy-talkies, and then you've got your dedicated mobile radios that fit into the dash or underneath the dash of your vehicle, your Jeep or your truck, whatever. Both are good options for various reasons, but can you kind of discuss the pros and cons of a handheld versus a mobile radio and vice versa?
Okay, so handhelds are great. They're a lot of fun. The room I'm in probably has more than 100 of them, but GMRS handhelds are super easy to use. When you just turn a knob and they're on the channels. Like you said, you just go buy them, turn them on. Actually, I guess buy them to charge the batteries because that's what the instruction says, then turn them on. And as long as you have a license, you can legally use it. You're on the air pretty quickly. Handhelds are great. They're mostly convenient. Most of them will fit, on your belt, in a shirt pocket, taped to your arm. That works really well. The real downside of the handhelds is they don't go very far. And so instead of tens of miles, you're only going to get 1 or 2 miles off a handheld. And that's where that starts to really draw that line. And it's not an either or thing. A lot of the off-roaders will have handhelds for their people if they're out, their spotters and stuff, and then mobile rigs for the truck itself. The mobile rigs are great. They're physically bigger. They're maybe 10 inches wide. Actually, these days they're not. They're about 8 inches wide and about 8 inches deep. They're fairly easy to install as long as you follow good electrical practices. And they are up to 50 watts where the handhelds are only 5 watts. So you're going to not only have more power, the antenna is going to give you a lot more range and a lot more functionality than you get off the handheld. And so in the trucks, it's probably you're best served to actually have a real installed radio. The exception to that is if you travel in a pack, a small pack, and you don't care about talking to anybody but in your group, then a handheld works. They're also fun on the freeway. If anybody played freeway tag or something, they're just easy to use, and the handhelds will get you going on the trail if you haven't had time or skills to install a mobile radio.
Is it fair to say that power, in the terms of watts, you mentioned that a mobile radio in the truck has more power than a traditional handheld. Is it fair to say that directly equates to how much range the radio will have?
It certainly directly correlates. The other big advantage that most people sort of ignore is the handhelds have and this is part of physics, this isn't because of any deficiency, the antennas on the handhelds just don't work very well. So there's a lot to be gained by the mobile antenna and the mobile radio. One other option that we didn't talk about, and we see it a lot in the off-road community, is mounting a antenna on your vehicle, not mounting a radio, but using the handhelds with cable converters to let the handhelds talk through a much better antenna. And that does improve your on-trail behavior of the radio.
Since we're talking about range, now's as good a time as any to talk about repeaters and how repeaters can really enhance the capabilities of a GMRS radio. Because not all radio classes can leverage the power of a repeater, but GMRS can. So talk about that.
Sure, this is great. So repeaters, the frequencies that GMRS, FRS, and the ham UHF, ultra high frequency range are on is the 400 megahertz range. And that range is very line of sight. So because of that, the radios are greatly affected by the terrain and any kind of foliage or anything kind of in between you. Because the radios are line of sight, if you put another radio up high, in our area that can be thousands of feet higher, then a truck can talk up to that repeater, the radio up on the mountain, and then any other truck that can see that repeater also can talk to it. So in my area, the repeaters can often be more than 100 miles of added range. It lets a small, and this works true for the handhelds too, so a very small signal that can see a mountaintop can communicate much farther, because all that has to happen is that two radios need to both be able to see that radio up on the mountain. In other areas without our mountains, you might be able to gain tens of miles. In some areas, they're on antenna towers, they're on tall buildings. There are all kinds of ways to put them where two sets of vehicles can see those repeaters.
So essentially what you're saying is that I can have a relatively low power handheld radio, and as long as I know that repeater's receive frequency and I'm within its range, I can transmit to that repeater, and that repeater will automatically take my signal and retransmit it at a much higher power level, which will significantly improve its range. And this all happens pretty darn quickly, right?
That's correct. And it works really well. And you see areas like right behind me is the Rubicon. There are repeaters up on the Rubicon that offer full coverage of that trail from beginning to end on the GMRS frequencies. So you can talk to your friends as they're beginning and ending.
And just to reinforce the point, this is a capability that CB and FRS do not have, but GMRS and ham radios do, correct?
That's correct. One of the great advantages that GMRS has, it does permit those repeaters, and it even does permit 50 watts of power. So GMRS has a lot of advantages over the other radio services. Now, hams are allowed thousands of watts of power, so ham has a whole nother set of advantages.
I think between the two of us, we can talk for the next couple of hours on the virtues of ham radio, but we got to confine this talk to about 30 minutes. So let's move on. Let's say we do have someone that is really convinced that they want to buy a GMRS radio. Do you have any like 101 style or ground floor purchase tips to make sure they buy the best one for their needs?
Probably the first thing to do is to apply for a license. You can apply for a license before you own a radio. So we'll call that the first step, right? Go for the $35. Your whole family can use it. And then you'll have a license, and you'll have some magic call sign, some call letters that you can use to stay legal. In terms of getting into GMRS, you'll see radios probably starting in the $30 to $50 range floating around. You'll see some higher end radios, especially like the Summit rugged radios that are physically made to really tolerate the trails and the off-road abuse a little bit better than some of the lower dollar radios. And then the radios actually can go up into the hundreds of dollars, adding things like GPS and Bluetooth. The nice thing with GMRS is channel 1 is channel 1 on every radio. So if you go in low, it's always, everybody I know has lots of radios. You can really never have too many. There's always one for the friend, one for the kids. So if you go in and you decide you want to go up or down in complexity, no problem. An extra radio is not a big problem. And since they're channelized the way they are, everybody can, you can just hand it to someone and off they go. But getting started, if you have a friend that already has a radio and they like it, that's always a good place to start, because then you got someone to call if you get confused or have a question about things. Getting started with GMRS is fairly easy, but it can become increasingly complex. So if you've got a friend who is familiar with a radio, then the one they have is always a good choice.
Okay, so I'm fairly confident that a lot of the folks listening to this podcast are competent and technically savvy enough to install a Spark-O-Matic car stereo. But when it comes to installing a radio that can transmit as well as receive, the installation process gets a little bit more complex. So can you give us some install advice?
You're talking about the 8-track hi-fi Spark-O-Matic? No?
Yeah, but I was always a Cracko man myself.
There we go. All right. So installing, one of the fun parts of owning an off-road vehicle is learning to work on it. Just like one of the fun parts of owning a house is becoming a good plumber, I guess. But installing a radio is fairly straightforward. All of the radios, most of the common radios will run on 12 volts, which makes that fairly easy because these vehicles all tend to have 12 volts, and even the military radios have a way to get 12 volts. There are certain practices that are true no matter whether you're installing lights or radios or any other accessory in your truck. You're going to want to get a good safe source of power. You're going to want to use circuit breakers to protect that circuit, and then you're going to use fuses to individually, kind of protect each device. Good practices are pretty well documented. Like I said, any off-road accessory is going to be the same. When you're putting in these radios, you want to be really careful to mount them solidly. You want to be aware that if you do have airbags, that you keep them out of the way, and because otherwise you'll eat a mic. And you want to mount them solid relative to the kind of off-roading you're going to do, because you don't want them bouncing around in the cab. Probably the hardest part of installing the radio, other than finding the 12 volts and getting it all installed and powered, is to get an antenna mounted. Fortunately, these days, that's easier than it used to be. The frequency that these radios run on, the antennas are very short. They're under a foot. The minimum requirement is going to be just under a foot, and then you'll see them going up to 4 or so feet. You want to mount it solidly. You want the vehicle to have a good ground plane. If you can, it will use the roof of the vehicle if it can as a ground plane. There are specifically antennas designed that function well. Originally, we used them only for Corvettes that didn't have any metal in them, but now they work really well on the side-by-sides, and those are called ground planeless antennas, is usually the word, ground not required. DX Engineering certainly sells a lot of those, and you'll find a lot of those around. They take into account the fact that many of the off-road vehicles, like the side-by-sides and the quads, just don't have enough metal. So that helps. But mounting the antenna is really important. The area that I live in, it's very obvious. To my east is the desert, and you can go really fast in the desert. To my south are the trees. The legendary, the Rubicon and Fordyce are behind me, and then the mountains. And so you need to be really conscious of how your vehicle will be used when you're mounting your antenna. I usually mount my antennas low, a little bit below shoulder height, and I mount them behind me so that any kind of trees that I might get into won't knock my antenna off or break it. In the desert, you're real conscious of rolling. That's pretty common, so be careful to pick an antenna that won't be hurt rolling. It's interesting, like even in Australia, they often mount their antennas in the front, and I'm always shocked when I see the aggressive off-road trucks there, but that protects them in a roll for most of the rolls. It's just important to get a good antenna, get it mounted, but do be conscious of what kind of off-roading you're going to do.
And it's perhaps worth mentioning, I don't know how big of a deal it is in some of the radio installs you've done, but unlike a car stereo, a radio transmitter, one that transmits a signal, tends to generate a little bit more heat, at least when it's operating on the transmit mode. So that may be a consideration to think about as well, right?
Heat's certainly an issue. I guess if people in your truck are arguing with the people behind you, you use it a lot. I usually don't worry that much about heat in a normal use radio because you're on and off so much. But you do want to be careful when you mount it. It's a good point also that if you think your truck or your Jeep will go swimming, which a lot of the Jeepers do, you certainly want to make sure you either have a waterproof radio or that you mount your radio in a good waterproof enclosure or up high. A lot of times I'll see people put them under their seats in the Jeeps, go swimming, and then they have no communications and no more radio. So it is good to protect the radio. If you do put them in a box, you want to be conscious about cooling, though, for sure.
Yeah, all good things to think about when it comes time to install a radio, any radio, in your rig. Now, since Dan and I are both licensed ham operators, we're kind of charged to be good stewards of these frequencies. So I want to emphasize something, and we've talked about it earlier, certainly, but it is important to realize, again, that you need a license to operate a GMRS radio or a ham radio on the amateur bands, according to the FCC. And by that I mean, in the eyes of the Federal Communications Commission, it is illegal to operate these radios without one, right?
That's correct. So the FCC is aware of these radios. They monitor these radios. You're supposed to, the law says you're supposed to identify in every 15 minutes or in every stream of communication. And that's true with both ham radio and with GMRS. You'll hear different kinds of practices. What's important is that you identify at a reasonably regular interval who you are. The license, obviously, they can look them up. You can look them up. So it is important to have a license, especially, in the ham bands where there's a skill test involved and certain responsibility for your signal. It's really important to have a license and identify who you are. In the GMRS bands, it helps them to identify who you are. In order to be on GMRS, the radios are specifically licensed as GMRS radios. That's not the license you apply for. That's the license the manufacturer applies for. That's called type acceptance. And the GMRS radios are very specific in terms of how they're accepted by the FCC to be used on GMRS. So that license is also kind of worth knowing about.
Yeah, because at the end of the day, the FCC is there to protect these frequencies so that people like us, off-roaders, ham radio enthusiasts, GMRS enthusiasts, can use them and enjoy them.
Absolutely. The FCC needs to know who these radios are. There's all kinds of reasons for it. They do make these bands available to us, and so it's kind of important to follow the rules and keep them open. If it starts to look like they're not open, then you'll lose them, which is how CB got created. They literally took that band from the hams, so it's important that everyone use the bands, use them appropriately, so enforcement doesn't become a problem and they remain available to us.
Very well said. Now, if someone wants to learn more about GMRS or even ham radio, whether it's install or the licensing requirements, do you have any good go-to resources? Like what can they go research to learn more about this topic?
The internet's just a wonderful thing, right? So researching GMRS is fairly easy. You'll find lots of resources, starting with Wikipedia has a great chapter or whatever article, I guess it would be, on GMRS. There are just lots of good resources about GMRS. Also, if you look at the various kind of off-road sites, there's a lot of discussion about GMRS and how it's used. And also you can get some great install ideas. Like when you're looking at a Jeep and wondering, how do I start putting it in, or where does the antennas go? If you look on the various ham radio sites or the various off-road sites, you'll see lots of good information about how the radios get installed, how they get used, those kinds of things. In terms of ham radio, the ARL, the American Radio Relay League, is a great resource. Obviously, DX Engineering sells lots of books to help you get started. YouTube is always a good resource. You have to find someone that you trust and that you like how they present, but that's always kind of a fun way to see it. I think those are the best resources in your area. If you participate with the off-road groups, the racing groups, you'll see lots of radios, and quickly it will become obvious which people are familiar with them and know how to use them, how to install them, and how to get help with them.
Now, I would be remiss if I didn't mention DX Engineering and its impeccable customer support. They have a legion of operators that live, breathe, eat, and sleep radio. So, Dan, correct me if I'm wrong. If folks out there listening to this podcast have questions about GMRS or ham radio, they can call you and your pals at DX Engineering, right?
If you have some questions, certainly you can call any of us at DX Engineering. DX Engineering, every employee is a ham radio operator, from the engineers all the way including the customer service reps. So everybody is familiar with radios and radio installs. One of the great things with DX Engineering is lots of us have very, very different experiences. Even in the area, I tend to get all the West Coast truck and Jeep build calls. Other people are more familiar with what goes on in other areas. So we're a good resource if you're looking. Certainly Summit has lots of great radios. And also one of the things at Summit, Summit has lots of great install tools and accessories that help you to put in a radio or any other accessories. And even I turn to Summit all the time for how do I put more parts in my trucks.
Things like wire crimpers, heat shrink tubing, heat guns, stuff like that?
Yeah, the very basics of install that when I ran my shop, we had it all over, and I would just run over and grab one. From the circuit breakers, the switches, the relays, the wire, the spade lugs, the fuses, the fuse blocks, all those kinds of things, Summit has them because 12-volt accessories are 12-volt accessories. So that's a great way to neatly wire your truck, your off-road vehicles, whatever, all the zip ties, everything's in there. And then both Summit and DX Engineering have great lines of radios, mounts, intercoms, all those kinds of things that help you make for a cleaner and more usable install.
That's some really good insight. Thank you, Dan. We've been talking with Dan, WB7OXP from DX Engineering, all about the importance of radio communications in off-roading and motorsports, with specific regard to ham radio and GMRS. And that'll do it. This is Paul, KJ8EEP, on the On All Cylinders podcast. Dan, thank you again for the time, and hope to hear you on the air. 73.
Rock on. Thanks for your time.
This has been the On All Cylinders podcast.
Powered by Summit Racing.
Check out new episodes coming soon at OnAllCylinders.com.
OnAllCylinders.com.
Thanks for listening.
See you next time.